2 weeks before our wedding, Natalie told me she'd been settling for me when she wanted passion instead. I should have known something was wrong when she started working late shifts at the veterinary clinic, coming home distracted and checking her phone constantly, but I attributed it to pre-wedding stress and the busy season at the animal hospital. What I didn't expect was for my world to collapse in our downtown Savannah loft on a Tuesday evening while wedding invitations sat stacked on our coffee table like accusations. I was reviewing final headcounts for our reception when Natalie walked through the door with that expression I'd later recognize as someone preparing to detonate a relationship. She moved around our living room with nervous energy, straightening wedding planning materials that were already organized, before finally settling across from me surrounded by vendor contracts, seating charts, and timeline spreadsheets that represented months of careful coordination. She told me she'd been having doubts about us, not about the wedding logistics or the timeline, but about us as a couple, about our entire 3-year relationship that had led to this moment. She explained that she'd reconnected with Caleb, her college ex-boyfriend who'd become some kind of traveling photographer documenting environmental changes, and seeing him again had made her realize what she'd been missing in her life with me. According to her, our relationship was comfortable and secure, like a warm blanket, but it lacked the spark she craved, the passion and adventure that Caleb represented with his artistic vision and spontaneous lifestyle. I sat there in stunned silence, my laptop still open to the catering spreadsheet, watching her explain how she'd been settling for stability when what she really wanted was excitement, spontaneity, a life full of artistic pursuits and constant travel to exotic locations. She made it sound like she'd been doing me some kind of favor by staying with me for 3 years, like I should be grateful she'd given me this much time before discovering she wanted something completely different from what we'd been building together. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was having this profound revelation while sitting in the loft I'd saved for 2 years to afford, overlooking the historic district she'd fallen in love with when we first moved in together, surrounded by evidence of the future we'd been planning with such careful attention to detail. She talked about Caleb's photography projects with a dreamy expression, his adventures documenting remote locations for environmental organizations, his artistic vision that made everything feel more vivid and alive than our quiet evenings spent researching marine conservation topics or planning weekend trips to coastal research sites. I listened to her describe this other life she apparently wanted, this version of herself that couldn't exist with a marine biology researcher who studied dolphin behavior patterns, preferred quiet evenings planning our future together, and found genuine excitement in the methodical work of scientific discovery. She never directly said she was leaving me for him, but the implication hung in the air like humidity before a summer storm, thick and oppressive and impossible to ignore. Instead, she talked around it with careful phrasing, using words like needing to explore what could be and not wanting to wake up in 20 years wondering what if she'd been braver, what if she'd chosen passion over practicality. She made it sound philosophical and self-reflective rather than what it actually was, which was her choosing someone else after 3 years of building something real and stable together, something I'd thought was precious and worth nurturing. The wedding planning materials scattered across our dining table suddenly looked ridiculous, like props from a play that had been canceled mid-performance without warning to the cast or crew. I'd spent months coordinating with the historic mansion venue, working with the Southern cuisine caterer to perfect a menu that reflected both our tastes, selecting magnolia and peach blossom arrangements that would complement the antebellum architecture she'd admired during our venue tour. We'd booked a jazz quartet that specialized in traditional Southern wedding music, ordered a 3-tier cake designed to match the venue's elegant aesthetic, and I'd even arranged a surprise honeymoon to the Outer Banks where she'd mentioned wanting to see wild horses on the beach during one of our early conversations about dream destinations. All of it planned with careful attention to details she'd mentioned in passing, preferences she'd expressed, dreams she'd shared during late-night conversations about what kind of wedding would feel authentically ours. But sitting there listening to her talk about passion and adventure with stars in her eyes, I realized that everything I'd interpreted as contentment and partnership had actually been her settling for something she considered beneath her true desires, a consolation prize while she waited for something better to come along. The man I'd been for 3 years, reliable and committed and genuinely excited about our future in marine conservation, wasn't the man she actually wanted to marry or spend her life building something meaningful with. She wanted someone who would whisk her away on spontaneous adventures to photogenic locations, someone whose lifestyle looked more interesting on social media, someone who represented the artistic, bohemian existence she'd apparently been craving all along while pretending to be happy with our stable, planned, purposeful life together. When she finished explaining her feelings with the careful tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation, she looked at me expectantly, like she wanted me to fight for us or beg her to reconsider or promise to become more like Caleb, more spontaneous and artistic and willing to abandon my career for romantic adventures. Instead, I stood up from the couch slowly, closed my laptop with its detailed wedding spreadsheets, and told her I understood perfectly that if that's what she wanted, she should absolutely pursue it without guilt or hesitation. The relief on her face was almost insulting, like she'd been worried I might actually put up resistance to her finding her true happiness with someone who appreciated her properly. She seemed genuinely surprised by my calm response, perhaps expecting more drama or emotional pleading or desperate attempts to change her mind, but I was already mentally calculating what needed to be done to extract myself from this situation with whatever dignity and self-respect remained intact. I woke up the next morning with absolute clarity about what needed to be done, and I approached it like any other research project that required methodical execution and attention to detail. By 7 a.m., I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, a legal pad, and every wedding contract we'd signed, ready to systematically dismantle the future we'd spent months constructing together. The first call went to the historic mansion venue, where I spoke with Margaret, the wedding coordinator who'd walked us through countless details about ceremony logistics and reception flow. I explained the situation in clinical terms, that the wedding would not be taking place as scheduled, and I needed to cancel all arrangements effective immediately. Margaret's voice shifted from professional efficiency to genuine concern as she offered to hold our date for a few weeks in case we worked things out, suggesting that pre-wedding jitters were completely normal and many couples experienced last-minute doubts. I thanked her for the consideration but explained that this wasn't a case of cold feet, that the decision was final and irreversible, and I needed to forfeit our deposit of $4,800 rather than leave them hanging with uncertainty. The finality in my voice must have convinced her because she shifted into damage control mode, expressing sympathy while explaining the cancellation policies I already knew by heart. Next came the Southern Cuisine Caterer, a family-owned business that specialized in elevated comfort food and had spent weeks perfecting our menu to balance Natalie's dietary preferences with traditional wedding fare. The owner, James, had become genuinely invested in our celebration, sharing stories about his own wedding and offering suggestions based on 30 years of catering experience. When I called to cancel, explaining that we would no longer need services for 200 guests, his disappointment was palpable even through the professional courtesy he maintained. He offered to scale down to a smaller celebration, perhaps an intimate gathering for family only, clearly hoping to salvage something from the situation. I explained that there would be no celebration of any kind, that I needed complete cancellation and understood we'd be forfeiting the $3,200 deposit we'd already paid. James paused for a long moment before expressing genuine regret, not about the lost business but about what he called the end of a love story he'd been honored to be part of. The florist presented complex logistics since Natalie had insisted on elaborate arrangements featuring magnolia branches, peach blossoms, and white hydrangeas that required advance ordering from multiple suppliers across Georgia. Linda had spent hours creating mock-ups and seasonal timelines to ensure peak bloom periods aligned with our wedding date, even connecting with specialty growers who cultivated heritage varieties of magnolia. When I called to cancel, she immediately asked if we wanted to postpone rather than cancel entirely, explaining that she'd already placed orders with her suppliers and could hold the arrangements for a future date. I told her there would be no future date, that everything needed to be canceled completely, and I understood this meant forfeiting our $2,800 deposit along with additional fees for orders already placed. Linda's voice became maternal as she expressed hope that whatever problems we were facing might resolve themselves, that love sometimes required fighting through difficult periods. I appreciated her optimism but explained that some situations were beyond repair, that this was one of those times when accepting reality was the kindest approach. The jazz quartet cancellation felt particularly symbolic since music had been one of the few wedding elements that genuinely excited me, The idea of sharing traditional Southern jazz with friends and family while celebrating the start of our married life together. Marcus, the bandleader, had spent considerable time understanding our musical preferences, creating a playlist that balanced romantic standards with upbeat dance numbers and even learning a specific song that held special meaning for us. When I called to cancel their services, Marcus offered to recommend other dates or even adjust their fee structure to accommodate budget concerns, clearly assuming financial stress was behind the cancellation. I explained that money wasn't the issue, that the wedding simply wouldn't be happening, and we'd need to forfeit our $1,500 deposit. Marcus wished me well with whatever I was going through, his musician's intuition picking up on the emotional undercurrents even though I kept my voice steady and businesslike throughout the conversation. The cake designer represented the culmination of Natalie's vision for elegant Southern sophistication, a 3-tier masterpiece featuring delicate sugar magnolia blossoms and buttercream that mimicked the texture of antebellum lace. Charlotte had met with us multiple times, sketching designs and conducting tastings until we'd created something that looked like it belonged in a museum exhibit about Southern wedding traditions. When I called to cancel, Charlotte's artistic sensibilities immediately understood that something significant had shifted, that this wasn't about logistics or timing but about fundamental changes in circumstance. She offered to create a smaller version of the design, perhaps a single-tier cake for a more intimate gathering, but I explained that there would be no gathering of any kind. The horse-drawn carriage and riverboat reception venue required separate calls since we'd booked additional services for what was supposed to be a fairy tale experience. The honeymoon cancellation to the Outer Banks involved complex logistics since I'd coordinated multiple reservations for what was supposed to be a surprise trip, including a beachfront cottage, guided tours to see the wild horses Natalie had dreamed about, and reservations at restaurants that specialized in fresh seafood. The travel agent, Rebecca, had spent hours crafting an itinerary that balanced adventure with relaxation, incorporating everything from lighthouse tours to secluded beaches perfect for romantic walks. When I called to cancel everything, Rebecca's concern was immediate and personal, asking if there was anything wrong with the accommodations or activities she'd arranged. I explained that the trip simply wouldn't be happening, that I needed complete cancellation of all reservations, and I understood this meant forfeiting deposits totaling nearly $3,000. By noon, I had confirmation emails from every vendor acknowledging complete cancellation of services, representing a total financial loss of nearly $18,000 in deposits and fees that couldn't be recovered on such short notice. I compiled every confirmation into a single PDF file, organized chronologically with vendor contact information and final disposition of each contract, treating the whole exercise like a research report that needed to be comprehensive and professional. The systematic approach felt oddly therapeutic, each canceled service representing another step away from a future that had already been destroyed, each forfeited deposit buying me freedom from obligations that no longer made sense. As I finished the last confirmation call, I realized I felt lighter rather than devastated, relieved rather than angry, like I'd successfully extracted myself from a situation that could have become much more complicated if I'd allowed emotion to cloud my judgment. Within 2 hours of sending the cancellation confirmations to Natalie, I had packed everything I owned into my truck and moved to a furnished apartment across town near the marine research facility where I worked. I drafted the email with the same clinical precision I used for research reports, subject line reading wedding arrangements status update, body text containing only the PDF attachment of vendor confirmations and a single sentence explaining that all arrangements had been canceled as discussed. I hit send while loading the last box into my truck, then drove away from the loft we'd shared without looking back, leaving my keys on the kitchen counter next to a brief note thanking her for 3 years and wishing her happiness with her new life. The furnished apartment was sterile and impersonal, exactly what I needed to avoid any reminders of the future I'd been planning, and its proximity to work meant I could throw myself into research projects that required my complete attention and focus. My phone started buzzing before I'd even finished unpacking, first with text messages that progressed from confusion to panic to outrage, then with voicemails that revealed the full scope of Natalie's emotional meltdown as the reality of the situation finally sank in. The first few messages were almost comical in their self-centered perspective, asking if I was having some kind of breakdown and demanding I fix the wedding situation immediately because guests had already made travel arrangements and her family had spent money on dresses. The tone shifted dramatically as she apparently read through the vendor confirmations and calculated the financial devastation, realizing that $18,000 in deposits had simply vanished overnight along with months of planning and coordination. Her voicemails became increasingly frantic as she cycled through different emotional strategies, first trying to blame me for being vindictive and cruel, then attempting manipulation by claiming she'd never actually intended to leave me but had simply been confused about her feelings. She accused me of being psychotic for moving out without discussion, of destroying something beautiful out of spite, of punishing her for being honest about her doubts when she'd simply needed reassurance and support. The irony of her calling honesty about wanting someone else a cry for reassurance wasn't lost on me, but I listened to each message with the same detached interest I might show when analyzing data from a failed experiment. Her family and friends began bombarding my phone with messages that ranged from concern to accusatory, each one painting me as the villain in a story where Natalie was the innocent victim of my sudden, inexplicable cruelty. Her sister left multiple voicemails explaining that Natalie was devastated and couldn't understand how someone who claimed to love her could be so heartless, that cold feet were normal and I should have fought for the relationship instead of destroying everything they'd worked to build together. Her mother called sobbing about the embarrassment of having to tell relatives that the wedding was canceled, about deposits lost and dresses that couldn't be returned, about how I'd ruined her daughter's dream wedding out of male pride and stubbornness. Friends from our social circle sent texts asking what had really happened, expressing disbelief that I could be so vindictive, demanding I explain my actions and fix the damage I'd caused to someone who'd only wanted to explore her feelings before making such a major commitment. I read each message with growing amazement at how completely the narrative had been twisted, how my calm acceptance of Natalie's choice to leave me for someone else had somehow become cruel abandonment of someone who'd simply had pre-wedding jitters. I changed my phone number by the end of the week and informed my research supervisor, Dr. Williams, that I'd be taking emergency leave to handle personal matters, requesting assignment to any field work that would take me away from Savannah until things settled down. Dr. Williams was understanding and professional about the whole situation, offering both the leave time and several research opportunities that would require extended travel, but then he mentioned something that stopped me cold and revealed the true scope of Natalie's deception. He explained that Natalie had actually called the lab several weeks earlier, asking detailed questions about my future earning potential, whether my research position was considered stable long-term, and what kind of advancement opportunities existed in marine biology academia. Dr. Williams had assumed she was planning something special for our wedding or perhaps considering graduate school herself, so he'd answered her questions thoroughly, explaining the funding structures and career trajectories that defined academic research positions. He'd told her about the competitive nature of research grants, the relatively modest salaries compared to private sector work, and the uncertainty that came with pursuing scientific careers that depended on external funding and institutional support. The conversation had apparently lasted nearly an hour, with Natalie asking increasingly specific questions about salary ranges, job security, and whether successful marine biologists ever achieved the kind of wealth that would support luxurious lifestyles. Dr. Williams realized now that she hadn't been planning a surprise or considering her own career options, but rather conducting due diligence on whether I represented a sound long-term financial investment, evaluating my worth as a potential husband based purely on earning capacity and upward mobility. The revelation hit me like ice water, confirming that everything about our relationship had been fundamentally dishonest, that while I'd been planning a future based on love and partnership, she'd been calculating return on investment and exit strategies. Her sudden rekindling with Caleb made perfect sense now, not as a romantic awakening but as a calculated upgrade to someone whose lifestyle and earning potential better matched her actual priorities and long-term goals. The fieldwork studying dolphin behavior patterns off the Georgia coast became my salvation, offering extended boat trips that provided natural isolation from the chaos Natalie had created while allowing me to focus on research that actually mattered. I threw myself into the work with renewed intensity, tracking pod movements and social interactions with the kind of methodical attention that had always calmed my mind, spending 12-hour days on research vessels collecting data that would contribute to genuine scientific understanding rather than someone's financial calculations. My colleague Zoe Martinez, a marine archaeologist from the neighboring research facility, became an unexpected anchor during this period, someone who understood both the demands of academic research and the satisfaction that came from discovering something meaningful about the natural world. She was working on a parallel project documenting shipwreck sites along the same coastal areas, which meant our research teams often coordinated boat schedules and shared resources, leading to conversations that started as professional collaboration but gradually became something deeper and more personal. Zoe had this remarkable ability to find perspective in difficult situations, perhaps because her work involved studying how civilizations rose and fell over centuries, making individual human drama seem appropriately small against the backdrop of historical time. She never asked invasive questions about why I'd suddenly thrown myself into extended fieldwork, but she had an intuitive understanding of when someone needed distraction versus when they needed to process difficult emotions, offering exactly the right kind of support without making it feel like charity or pity. 3 weeks into the fieldwork, I had to return to Savannah briefly to collect additional equipment and submit preliminary research reports, which meant facing the possibility of running into Natalie or dealing with the aftermath of whatever narrative she'd constructed about our breakup. I'd been dreading this return to civilization, but Zoe offered to accompany me into town, ostensibly to pick up supplies for her own research but really to provide moral support during what could be an emotionally charged encounter. We were loading equipment into my truck outside the marine facility when Natalie appeared in the parking lot, clearly having been watching for my return, looking gaunt and manic in a way that suggested the past few weeks hadn't been kind to her mental state. She approached with that combination of desperation and entitlement that I'd come to recognize as her default mode when she wasn't getting what she wanted, demanding to know why I was ignoring her attempts to contact me and insisting that we needed to talk about fixing the mess I'd created by canceling everything. I introduced Zoe calmly as my colleague, maintaining professional courtesy while Natalie's eyes darted between us with obvious suspicion and jealousy, clearly calculating whether this woman represented competition or simply another obstacle to her reconciliation plans. Natalie's appearance was shocking in itself. She'd lost significant weight and looked like she hadn't been sleeping, her usual polished presentation replaced by the frazzled desperation of someone whose carefully constructed life had fallen apart more quickly than she'd anticipated. She oscillated between defensive justifications for her behavior and desperate attempts to engage me in conversation about our relationship, insisting that she'd never actually intended to leave me but had simply been confused about her feelings and needed time to figure things out. The manipulation was transparent but exhausting, her voice taking on that wheedling quality that suggested she expected me to feel sorry for the consequences of her own choices and somehow rescue her from the situation she'd created. It was during this tense encounter that I met Caleb himself, who pulled up in an expensive rental car loaded with camera equipment, clearly treating the whole situation like some kind of artistic photo opportunity rather than the emotional devastation of multiple people's lives. He was exactly what I'd expected from Natalie's descriptions, a pretentious man in his early 30s who wore his camera like jewelry and spoke about his artistic vision in the kind of grandiose terms that suggested he took himself far more seriously than his actual accomplishments warranted. Caleb had the studied casual appearance of someone who spent considerable time and money trying to look effortlessly bohemian, with expensive jeans worn just so and a vintage leather jacket that had probably cost more than most people made in a month, the kind of manufactured authenticity that appealed to people who confused lifestyle branding with genuine substance. He positioned himself slightly behind Natalie with the air of someone who expected to be recognized and admired, occasionally adjusting his camera settings or checking his phone in ways that seemed calculated to draw attention to his equipment and reinforce his identity as a serious artist. I watched this performance with the same detached fascination I might show when observing animal behavior, noting how he managed to insert himself into every conversational exchange without actually contributing anything meaningful, clearly more interested in documenting the drama than resolving it. Natalie seemed nervous around him in a way that suggested their relationship wasn't as stable or satisfying as she'd convinced herself it would be, constantly seeking his approval and validation while he remained focused on his cameras and his aesthetic rather than her emotional needs. The encounter lasted perhaps 10 minutes, during which I maintained complete emotional detachment while Natalie grew increasingly frustrated by my refusal to engage with her manipulation attempts, eventually storming off with Caleb trailing behind her, still adjusting his camera settings like he'd just finished filming a documentary scene. Zoe waited until they were completely out of sight before commenting that some people seem to confuse real life with performance art, and that I'd probably saved myself from years of exhausting drama by getting out when I did, observations delivered with the kind of dry humor that made even painful situations feel manageable. News of Caleb's betrayal reached me through the marine biology conference circuit 3 months later, where gossip traveled with remarkable speed among the tight-knit community of researchers who all seemed to know each other's business despite being scattered across different institutions and specialties. I was presenting preliminary findings from my dolphin behavior research at a regional symposium when Dr. Patricia Chen from the University of Georgia Marine Science Department approached me during the coffee break with that expression people wear when they have information they're not sure whether to share. She mentioned that she'd heard through mutual connections about my canceled wedding and hoped I was doing well, then hesitated before adding that there had been some rather dramatic developments involving my former fiancée and her photographer boyfriend that might interest me from a purely academic perspective on human behavior patterns. According to Dr. Chen, who had connections throughout the Savannah academic and arts communities, Caleb had convinced Natalie to invest her entire savings account and take out additional loans totaling $25,000 to fund what he described as a groundbreaking documentary photography expedition to document climate change impacts in remote Arctic locations. The project sounded impressive when he presented it, complete with detailed itineraries, environmental impact studies, and partnerships with international conservation organizations that would supposedly provide additional funding and distribution for the final documentary series. Natalie had apparently been thrilled by the opportunity to support meaningful environmental work while also investing in Caleb's artistic career, seeing it as the kind of purposeful adventure that validated her decision to leave our stable but supposedly uninspiring relationship for something more significant and socially conscious. She'd liquidated her retirement savings, maxed out her credit cards, and even borrowed money against her car to meet Caleb's funding requirements, convinced that she was investing in both their future together and a project that would make a genuine difference in raising awareness about environmental destruction. The expedition was completely fabricated, existing only in Caleb's imagination and the professionally designed promotional materials he'd created to support his fundraising efforts from multiple sources beyond just Natalie. Dr. Chen explained that Caleb had been running similar schemes with various women across different cities, presenting himself as a serious environmental photographer while actually using the money to fund his lifestyle and travel expenses with an entire network of girlfriends who each believed they were his only romantic partner and financial supporter. The revelation about his multiple relationships had emerged when one of his other victims, a marine biology graduate student from Florida, had started investigating his background after becoming suspicious about the lack of progress on the supposed documentary project that she'd also funded with several $1,000s of her own money. This woman had discovered Caleb's social media accounts under different names, each one featuring him with different girlfriends in different states, all of whom appeared to be providing financial support for various versions of the same fictional environmental documentary project. The graduate student had contacted several of these women, including Natalie, and together they'd pieced together the scope of Caleb's deception, realizing that he'd been systematically exploiting their environmental concerns and romantic attachments to fund what was essentially an elaborate vacation lifestyle with no genuine artistic or scientific purpose. Dr. Chen mentioned that the revelation had hit Natalie particularly hard because she'd not only lost her money but had also discovered that everything about her relationship with Caleb had been calculated manipulation designed to extract maximum financial benefit while providing him with temporary companionship and social media content. The environmental documentary that had supposedly justified their relationship and her financial sacrifice had never existed beyond the planning stage. And even those plans had been copied from legitimate research projects that Caleb had found online and repurposed for his own fraudulent purposes. The financial devastation was compounded by the emotional humiliation of realizing that she'd abandoned a genuine relationship with someone who actually cared about her future in favor of a con artist who saw her as nothing more than a convenient source of funding for his expensive tastes and nomadic lifestyle. Dr. Chen had heard through the academic grapevine that Natalie's father had visited our marine research facility several weeks earlier, looking for me with what could only be described as a broken expression, apparently hoping to discuss the possibility of reconciliation since his daughter had been so thoroughly manipulated and financially destroyed by someone he now understood was essentially a professional predator. Dr. Williams had apparently been diplomatic but clear that I was involved in extended fieldwork and unavailable for personal meetings, though he'd expressed genuine sympathy for the family's situation while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries about sharing my contact information or whereabouts. The conversation with Dr. Chen left me with complicated feelings about the entire situation, because while I felt vindicated in my assessment of Caleb's character and my decision to extract myself from the drama, I also felt genuine sympathy for anyone who'd been victimized by such calculated deception, even someone who'd hurt me in the process of falling for his manipulation. What struck me most was how completely Natalie's judgment had been compromised by her desire for excitement and social status, leading her to ignore obvious warning signs that she would have recognized immediately in any other context, blinded by the appeal of someone who represented the kind of lifestyle she thought she wanted. The last she'd heard, Caleb had disappeared entirely after the extent of his deception became clear, probably moving on to another city and another set of potential victims, leaving behind a trail of financial and emotional devastation among women who'd believed they were supporting both environmental conservation and a meaningful relationship. Natalie launched an increasingly desperate campaign to reconnect with me over the following months, using new phone numbers, email addresses, and even creating fake social media profiles to monitor my activities and find ways to circumvent the communication barriers I'd established after changing my contact information. Her messages evolved from angry accusations about my supposed cruelty in abandoning her during her time of need to tearful confessions that she'd never stopped loving me and that Caleb had been nothing more than a midlife crisis fantasy that she now recognized as the biggest mistake of her life. She enlisted family members, mutual friends, and even former colleagues from the veterinary clinic to plead her case, each message painting her as a victim of manipulation who deserved compassion and understanding rather than the cold indifference I'd shown throughout her ordeal with someone she now understood was essentially a professional predator. Her sister left voicemails explaining that Natalie had learned valuable lessons about appreciating genuine love over superficial excitement, that she now understood the difference between someone who truly cared about her well-being versus someone who saw her as a convenient source of funding and validation. Her mother sent emails describing how Natalie had been taken advantage of by someone who exploited her generous nature and environmental concerns, emphasizing that her daughter's only crime had been trusting too easily and wanting to support meaningful work that would make a positive difference in the world. Former colleagues reached out through professional networks, sharing stories about how devastated Natalie appeared whenever my name came up in conversation, how she'd expressed deep regret about her treatment of someone who'd clearly loved her unconditionally and planned their future together with such careful attention to her happiness and security. The manipulation reached its peak when she began claiming to be experiencing serious health problems and depression as a direct result of losing both Caleb and me, with her mother leaving increasingly frantic voicemails begging me to show mercy because her daughter was wasting away from grief and guilt about the choices that had led to such complete isolation from everyone who genuinely cared about her well-being. These health claims felt particularly manipulative given that I knew Natalie's tendency to dramatize situations when she wasn't getting the attention or sympathy she felt she deserved, turning normal emotional consequences into medical emergencies that required immediate intervention from people she'd previously taken for granted or actively hurt. I learned through Dr. Williams that she'd actually contacted the Marine Research Facility multiple times, trying different approaches to reach me, first claiming to have important information about my research that required immediate discussion, then pretending to be a representative from a grant-funding organization with time-sensitive questions about my current projects. Dr. Williams had handled these attempts with professional courtesy while maintaining strict boundaries about sharing any information regarding my whereabouts or availability, eventually having to involve facility security when her calls became more frequent and her stories more elaborate and obviously fabricated. What made her campaign particularly exhausting was how she seemed to view my silence and absence as a challenge to be overcome rather than a clear communication about my desire to move forward without her involvement, interpreting my lack of response as playing hard to get rather than genuine disinterest in rebuilding any kind of relationship with someone who demonstrated such poor judgment and manipulative tendencies. Meanwhile, my relationship with Zoe had been developing naturally through our shared research projects and genuine compatibility, evolving from professional collaboration to something deeper and more meaningful without any of the drama or calculation that had characterized my experience with Natalie. Zoe appreciated my methodical approach to both research and life planning, finding my attention to detail and long-term thinking attractive rather than suffocating, understanding that careful preparation and consideration were signs of someone who took commitments seriously rather than someone who was trying to control outcomes through excessive planning. We'd begun spending our off-duty time together exploring coastal areas for both research and personal enjoyment, sharing meals and conversations that felt effortless and genuine, building something based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than financial calculations or lifestyle aspirations. Zoe had a PhD in marine archaeology and made her own substantial income through research grants and consulting work, which meant our relationship was developing between equals who both contributed meaningfully to the partnership rather than one person supporting the other's lifestyle choices and career aspirations. She found my stories about Natalie both fascinating and horrifying from an anthropological perspective, observing that some people seemed to approach relationships like business transactions where they evaluated potential partners based on return on investment rather than emotional compatibility and shared values. The contrast between Zoe's straightforward, intellectually curious approach to life and Natalie's manipulative, financially motivated decision-making became more apparent as I spent time with someone who genuinely enjoyed my company rather than tolerating it while waiting for something better to come along. When Zoe met my parents during a research conference in Atlanta, they immediately noticed the difference in how she interacted with me compared to their memories of Natalie, commenting later that Zoe seemed to actually listen when I talked about my work rather than waiting for her turn to redirect the conversation toward her own interests and concerns. My mother particularly appreciated how Zoe asked thoughtful questions about marine conservation and seemed genuinely interested in understanding the broader implications of our research rather than viewing my career as either a financial asset or a boring obligation to be endured. One evening while we were reviewing data from our respective research projects, Zoe mentioned that she'd been approached by someone claiming to be a friend of mine who wanted to know more about our relationship and whether it was serious, someone who'd seemed unnecessarily interested in our future plans and my emotional availability for reconnecting with people from my past. The description matched Natalie perfectly, confirming that her surveillance and manipulation attempts had expanded to include investigating my current relationships and possibly planning some kind of intervention or confrontation that would force me to acknowledge her presence and address her attempts at reconciliation. This revelation made me realize that simply ignoring Natalie's communications wasn't going to be sufficient to end her campaign, that her desperation and sense of entitlement were likely to escalate until I took more decisive action to establish permanent boundaries that she couldn't circumvent through creativity and persistence. Natalie appeared unannounced at my apartment on a stormy Thursday evening 6 months after our last encounter, having somehow obtained my new address through methods I could only imagine involved considerable effort and possibly some questionable research tactics given her demonstrated willingness to create fake identities and manipulate professional contacts. I heard the tentative knocking during a downpour that had been building all afternoon, and when I opened the door I found her standing there soaked and disheveled, looking like she'd been waiting outside for hours working up the courage to actually knock. Her usual polished appearance replaced by the desperate determination of someone who decided this was her last chance to make things right. She immediately launched into a rehearsed speech about making the biggest mistake of her life and begging for just 5 minutes to explain herself properly, to tell me everything she'd learned about herself and about what really mattered in relationships, claiming she now understood the difference between genuine love and the kind of shallow attraction that had led her to make such catastrophically poor decisions. I stood in the doorway without inviting her in, maintaining both physical and emotional boundaries while she delivered what sounded like a carefully prepared presentation about personal growth and hard-learned lessons, her voice taking on that pleading quality that suggested she expected her suffering to automatically translate into forgiveness and reconciliation. She talked about how losing both Caleb and me had forced her to confront her own values and priorities, how she'd realized that stability and genuine care were infinitely more valuable than excitement and adventure, that she'd been chasing illusions while abandoning the one person who'd actually understood and appreciated her for who she really was beneath all the surface attractions. The manipulation was transparent but delivered with such apparent sincerity that I almost felt sorry for her, though I remained aware that this entire performance was fundamentally self-serving, designed to make me feel responsible for her emotional rehabilitation rather than acknowledging that her choices had natural consequences that weren't my responsibility to fix. She claimed to have been in therapy working through her issues with commitment and materialism, learning to value emotional intimacy over financial security, developing better judgment about people's true character rather than being swayed by superficial charm and lifestyle presentations. Her speech was interrupted when Emma arrived for our planned dinner date, pulling up in her car just as Natalie was explaining how she'd finally learned to appreciate what we'd had together and wanted nothing more than the chance to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of genuine mutual respect and shared goals. Emma stepped out of her car wearing my grandmother's engagement ring that I'd proposed with just 3 days earlier, a decision we'd made quietly and privately during a research expedition when we'd realized that our partnership felt more natural and sustainable than anything either of us had experienced before. The shock on Natalie's face when she noticed the ring was profound and immediate, her carefully rehearsed speech dissolving into stammered questions about how quickly I'd moved on and whether I'd ever actually cared about our 3 years together if I could replace her so easily with someone I'd known for such a short time. Emma handled the situation with remarkable grace, introducing herself politely and expressing genuine sympathy for what Natalie was obviously going through, but also making it clear through her calm confidence that she wasn't intimidated by the dramatic confrontation or concerned about competing with someone from my past. I explained calmly that Emma represented everything Natalie had claimed she wanted in a partner, someone who valued genuine partnership and shared interests over financial calculations and lifestyle aspirations, someone who appreciated thoughtful planning and mutual support rather than finding these qualities suffocating or insufficient. The contrast between Emma's composed professionalism and Natalie's desperate emotional manipulation was stark and immediately apparent, highlighting the difference between someone who felt secure in their relationship and someone who was trying to reclaim something they'd voluntarily discarded when it no longer served their purposes. Natalie's response revealed the extent to which she'd never actually understood why our relationship had ended, as she began accusing me of moving on too quickly and never really loving her if I could find someone else so soon after she'd made herself available for reconciliation. She seemed unable to grasp that I'd moved on not in spite of loving her but because I'd finally understood that she'd never actually wanted the person I was, only the security and stability I could provide while she waited for someone more exciting to come along. Her accusations escalated into threats about making me pay for my supposed betrayal and abandonment, revealing that beneath all her talk about personal growth and learned lessons, she still fundamentally believed that I owed her something, that her suffering entitled her to consideration and forgiveness regardless of how she'd treated me during our relationship. I told her clearly and finally that I'd found someone who actually wanted to build a life with me rather than settling for what I could provide while fantasizing about something better, someone who saw my planning and consideration as evidence of care rather than as limitations on their freedom and adventure. Emma and I went inside and closed the door while Natalie stood on the steps shouting about how I'd ruined her life and stolen her chance at happiness, but her voice was quickly swallowed by the storm, and within minutes she'd apparently given up and left, taking with her the last remnants of a relationship that had been over the moment she'd decided I wasn't sufficient for her dreams and aspirations. As we turned off the lights and settled in for the evening, Emma mentioned that she could understand how someone might take my reliability and devotion for granted if they'd never experienced genuine emotional instability or financial insecurity, but that anyone who'd lived through real uncertainty would recognize these qualities as exactly what made relationships sustainable and meaningful over time. I realized that evening that the greatest revenge wasn't hatred or anger but the quiet satisfaction of building something authentic with someone who genuinely appreciated the person I'd always been, someone who saw my careful nature and long-term thinking as strengths rather than weaknesses to be tolerated while searching for more exciting alternatives. 6 months later, Emma and I were married in a small ceremony at the Marine Research Station, surrounded by colleagues who understood our shared passion for conservation work and friends who'd watched our relationship develop naturally through mutual respect and common goals, creating the kind of celebration that felt genuine and purposeful rather than performative or designed for social media validation. We spent our honeymoon conducting joint research in the Florida Keys, combining Emma's archaeological work with my dolphin behavior studies in a collaboration that felt like the perfect metaphor for what marriage should actually be: two people with complementary skills working together toward shared objectives that mattered to both of them. I never heard from Natalie again after that final confrontation, and I genuinely hoped she'd found whatever she was actually looking for, whether that was someone who could provide the excitement and adventure she'd craved or simply the self-awareness to build relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than financial calculations and lifestyle aspirations.